Bentley here, and good evening to you. On behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I welcome you to A Climate of Change, our live cast exploring with thought leaders from across Canada, and now I guess you'd say the world, what these wildly unprecedented times mean for addressing the climate crisis here in Alberta, and how to create the impactful change we need. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Yaqtsi Nakota Nations, the Métis Nations of Region 3, and all people who make their home in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. I'd like to also make a second land acknowledgement on behalf of another group of folks that have a stake in this land that we stand on today, and that is our children, our nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and all future generations. I urge you to keep them in mind during this time as we face unprecedented change and start making decisions about what comes next. On to the show. 1,000 years from now, when historians look back at the climate timeline, one of the early milestones on that timeline will have the name of tonight's guest, world-renowned lead author of the hockey stick curve that demonstrates our planet's rapid heating and its relationship to humankind's CO2 emissions. In fact, I like to say that before there was an Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, there was Dr. Michael E. Mann's hockey stick curve, with no slight whatsoever to Mr. Gore's important work. His latest book, The New Climate War, extensively details the long history of denial and delay that has so effectively prevented humankind from addressing climate change up until very recently, and lays out what tactics remain now that outright denial has become untenable. Please consider buying Dr. Mann's book from your local bookstore, and I believe there still may be a few autograph-plated copies available, courtesy of the University of Lethbridge bookstore, the link for which is in the chat. So, without further ado, on behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub and the Climate Hub of Southern Alberta and the City of Calgary Climate Symposium, it is an incredible honor to welcome you to our show tonight. Dr. Michael E. Mann, welcome to A Climate of Change.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. I guess I will go ahead and share my screen and do that presentation, and we'll have some conversation afterwards. I'm gonna go full screen. Here we are. I am going to be talking about basically about my new book, The New Climate War, and what it is about is the challenges that we still face in this effort to confront what is arguably the greatest threat that we face in the years ahead, the threat of human-caused climate change, and the obstacles that still lie in our path. I think many of us can feel that we're actually very close now to seeing the action that so many have worked for decades. We're starting to see some real movement, a sort of global awareness that we need to address this crisis. But there are some forces of inaction, I call them the inactivists in the book, who continue to benefit from our reliance and our addiction to fossil fuels and are still trying to prevent the necessary transition from fossil fuels towards renewable energy and climate-friendly practices. And that's what the new climate war is. The old climate war was the effort by fossil fuel interests and those promoting their agenda to attack the underlying science of climate change. And I found myself at the center of those attacks because of the so-called hockey stick curve that you heard about previously. Well, we can now see the impacts of climate change playing out in real time. They've become clear to the person on the street. And that means that it is no longer credible for the forces of inaction to deny that climate change is real or human caused. And instead, what we see is a variety of tactics that are aimed at forestalling action on climate that fall short of outright denialism, but involve efforts to deflect attention away from the needed systemic solutions, or efforts to divide advocates so they don't speak with one voice, or even to promote doom and despair, which can lead to disengagement. So let's start out with a brief discussion of the science of the projections. And I'm not going to show you model predictions based on state-of-the-art global climate models, elaborate models that we run today that resolve the features of the ocean and the atmosphere and the ice sheets and the biology and the chemistry, extremely elaborate models. I'm going to talk about a simple calculation that was done back in the early 1980s. And it wasn't by climate scientists, it was by the world's largest fossil fuel company, ExxonMobil. In a report in the early 1980s, their own scientists, ExxonMobil's scientists within their division that was studying the potential impacts of climate change, they referred to those impacts as potentially catastrophic. Those were ExxonMobil's own words describing what might happen if we continue on this course of fossil fuel burning. And they made a prediction, an impressive prediction, decades into the future. In fact, what you're looking at here is their prediction of where we would be right now if we continued business as usual burning of fossil fuels, with CO2 concentrations about 420 parts per million, which is very close to what they are, and a warming, if you add on the warming before 1960, because this graph starts at 1960, a warming of the planet relative to pre-industrial times of about 1.2 degrees Celsius. So ExxonMobil's own scientists predicted the increase in CO2 concentrations and the warming that would result in. And they referred to the potential consequences as catastrophic. But instead of coming clean, going public with their findings and engaging in an open conversation about what choices we have and what risks we face, they engaged in a multi-million-dollar campaign to discredit independent climate scientists who were coming to the same conclusion that their own internal scientists had come to. That is, if you will, the climate wars, the effort by ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel interests and conservative media outlets doing their bidding and front groups doing their bidding to attack the scientific evidence for human-caused climate change. Now, if we had acted 2 decades ago when the science was already in, when we knew we had a problem, it would have been fairly straightforward for us to lower those carbon emissions, you see this curve here, fast enough, steadily enough to avoid warming the planet beyond a very dangerous 1.5 degrees Celsius, roughly 3 degrees Fahrenheit. If we had acted when we already knew we had a problem, when the IPCC back in 1995 concluded that there was already a discernible human influence on the planet, if we had acted then, it wouldn't have been that hard to bring those carbon emissions down in time to avoid catastrophic warming of the planet. But because of the effort by ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel interests to attack the science, we face a much more steeper curve now. We've got to bring those carbon emissions down far more dramatically now in the years ahead if we are to avert a catastrophic 1.5 degree warming. We've got to bring them down by a factor of 2 within the next decade and to net zero by 2050 if we're to have any hope of doing that. So that was what the cost of 2 decades of inaction, which we contribute to the effort by fossil fuel interests and those doing their bidding to forestall action on climate. That's the opportunity cost that we have paid. And the impacts, we don't have to use our imagination anymore. We can see them playing out in real time. Let me talk about my sabbatical in Australia last year. I was there for the so-called Black Summer, perhaps the most profound example of climate change induced extreme weather that we have yet witnessed, where the entire continent of Australia was ablaze during their summer, what they now call the Black Summer. I was there on sabbatical. I arrived just as this was unfolding, and rather than studying the impacts of climate change on extreme weather, which is what I had gone to Australia to collaborate with other scientists there to do, I ended up observing and living those impacts. Now that was a little over a year ago at the height of their dry season when they were experiencing unprecedented heat and drought and these massive bushfires. And we've all seen the images that came out of that almost apocalyptic episode. Now, a little more than a year later, actually now we're into the wet season, March. And instead, we have seen the worst flooding in decades. In fact, by some estimates, a 100-year flood, a flood that shouldn't happen more often than once in 100 years in the absence of climate change. Of course, those extreme floods are getting more common. Some of you may have seen this video. Your eyes aren't deceiving you. That is a house flowing down a river, floating down a river, a house. Again, almost apocalyptic visions, but of the other extreme, not the heat and the wildfires, but unprecedented flooding. Now, this is actually one of the predictions from current generation climate models. If you look at what the models show, in many regions, including the sort of south coast of Australia, we expect wetter wet seasons and drier dry seasons. The extremes become more extreme. And that appears to be what we're seeing in places like New South Wales and Australia and other regions around the world. Again, this is something the models predict, and we're seeing it. I have a commentary that appeared just yesterday in The Guardian about those extremes, that sort of alternation between unprecedented bushfires and unprecedented flooding. That is the signature of climate change. Here in North America, in Europe, we've seen unprecedented heat waves in recent summers, the hottest temperature ever reliably recorded on the planet in Death Valley just last summer. Our own apocalyptic wildfires on the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, an unprecedented hurricane season, Atlantic hurricane season, 30 named storms in one season, something I never thought I would actually live to see. But we actually predicted with our own model a very active season last year. And that was because of the anomalous warmth in the tropical Atlantic Ocean. All of the things being equal, the warmer those ocean waters, the more hurricane activity, more of these storms, but even more significantly, more intense storms. That's a very clear prediction of climate models. More energy to intensify these storms into category 5 monster storms, like we've seen in the Atlantic and other regions in recent years. In fact, that same summer when we were seeing an unprecedented hurricane season in the Atlantic, we also saw the strongest landfalling tropical storm / hurricane / typhoon in history. That was Goni, that made landfall with 195 mile per hour winds. Here's a satellite image. Late in the season, well into October, Hurricane Epsilon, we were well into the Greek alphabet, and we were still seeing hurricanes in late October. This is Hurricane Epsilon, the satellite image, which shows sort of these dual threats of climate change that are playing out, and they're both captured in a single image here, because we have this late season hurricane in the North Atlantic. But if you look at the upper edge of that satellite image, you'll see that sort of brownish haze. That's smoke from the wildfires of Colorado that were burning at the time. Let me talk a little bit about Alberta. The costliest disaster, I would call it a natural disaster, but it wasn't a natural disaster. It was a disaster made worse by climate change, the Fort McMurray wildfires that Alberta witnessed just a few years ago. Now, of course, we know hotter temperatures, drier soils, more fuel for these wildfires, more heat. You combine the drought, the heat. It's not rocket science. You get faster spreading, hotter burning, more intense, larger wildfires, like the massive Fort McMurray wildfire. But there's another ingredient that I want to talk about here, because it isn't just the hotter, drier soils. That's all pretty basic stuff. But the behavior of our atmosphere, and in particular the jet stream in the summer season. There's a phenomenon that my co-authors and I have been studying in recent years. It has a fancy name. It's called quasi-resonant amplification. What it means, you see these big waves in the jet stream, and where you see big waves, big ridges and big troughs. The upward part is a ridge, the downward part is a trough. You've got huge weather systems underneath, a big high pressure system out west that gives you heat, gives you drought, gives you wildfires in California. And then this trough, this low pressure system back east, gives you the record rainfall we saw in summer 2018 when they had wildfires out west, unprecedented wildfires out west. We had the wettest summer on record here in State College, Pennsylvania, in a large part of the eastern US. And that had to do with the way that the jet stream gets wigglier and gets slower. It slows down so those systems stay fixed in space. Those high pressure systems stay in the same location, baking the soils day after day. That low pressure lobe sits over the same location, dumping rainfall over that location day after day. That's what happens when you get these big waves in the atmosphere and they become stationary. They just don't move on. And without going into the details, because it actually requires you to solve the same mathematical equations that were developed to solve problems in quantum mechanics in the early 1900s. It turns out that this phenomenon becomes more common when the planet warms up, when the Arctic warms up faster than the lower latitudes. Say the Arctic warms up faster than the United States and most of Canada. So you decrease that temperature contrast between the cold Arctic and the warmer mid-latitudes. And it's that temperature contrast that actually governs the jet stream. And so you get this slower jet stream, this wigglier jet stream. And we've shown that climate change is causing that phenomenon, this quasi-resonant amplification phenomenon, to become more common. And we can see it in the data, and we expect it for theoretical reasons. And to bring this back to the problem at hand, and there's an article I wrote in Scientific American that sort of breaks this down in sort of non-technical terms, what's going on here. And I would encourage folks to check it out if you're more interested. The bottom line is that those Alberta wildfires in 2016, colleagues of mine with whom I've collaborated in studying this particular phenomenon have shown that it was happening during those Alberta wildfires. So that amplification phenomenon that leads to these very persistent weather extremes, that was part of what was going on in Alberta. And here's the thing, the global climate models that we use to predict future climate change, the models do a lot of things very well, but they still don't capture this phenomenon because the physics occur at a small enough scale that the models don't quite resolve the underlying physics. And so the models are not capturing this phenomenon, which means they're not capturing this phenomenon, which is responsible for a lot of these very extreme weather events that we're seeing in North America, in Europe, and around the rest of the planet. This is the face of climate change. It's no longer about polar bears up in the Arctic decades from now. It's about damaging extreme weather events that we are feeling, that we are experiencing, that we are suffering through today. And that's with a little more than 1 degree Celsius warming of the planet. If that's what 1 degree Celsius warming of the planet does, imagine what 4 degrees Celsius does, because we could reach that by the end of the century if we fundamentally don't act to avert a climate crisis. So the climate wars, I've talked about them a bit. And since I think we're gonna try to go a little faster than I had originally planned here, I'm not gonna play these videos. I have confronted climate change deniers in the US Congress. Joe Barton of Texas, who was the former Republican chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and held hearings to try to discredit the hockey stick curve. And I testified to his committee. Just back in 2017, another Texan, Lamar Smith, also a climate change denier, also interestingly, a recipient of a large amount of fossil fuel money, held a hearing also to try to discredit the science of climate change. And I testified at that hearing and sort of called out, this charade where we still have prominent politicians denying what people can see with their own two eyes, that this is happening and it's real. And we will skip past that. That's the old climate war, the attack, the assault on the basic scientific evidence. But it's largely gone away. It's largely behind us because you just can't credibly deny what people can see with their own two eyes. That doesn't mean that the forces of inaction, the inactivists, have given up, but they've moved on from that sort of hardcore climate change denialism to these newer tactics, this more insidious array of tactics that are still intended to prevent us from moving off fossil fuels. But they come short of outright denying the science. They, for example, downplay the scientific evidence. Yes, climate change is real, but it's not really a problem, says Bjorn Lomborg, one of the more prominent soft denialists. And he brandishes a Greenpeace t-shirt to show that he's an environmentalist while he minimizes the predictions from climate models, downplays the impacts that climate change is having on sea level rise, for example, by cherry picking a tiny little bit of the curve when the curve had flattened out for a couple years and pointing to that and saying sea level rise has stopped. Well, that red circle is what he was pointing to, and the blue curve is what actually has happened. So ways to sort of portray climate concern as a false alarm. Yes, I accept the science. Yes, the planet is warming up, but it won't be that much, and it won't be that bad for us. That's what soft denial is. And it's very commonplace. It's sort of the preferred form of denial today because you can't get away with denying the basic science. But if you can deny that climate change is really any problem, or you can discredit the solutions, renewable energy, then you're still serving the agenda of powerful special interests, the fossil fuel industry, that want to see us remain addicted to fossil fuels. And they don't care why. They don't care if it's because we deny that climate change is real, or that we don't think we can do anything about it, or that there is no viable solution yet. They don't care which of those things that we believe, as long as it leads us to disengagement, as long as it prevents us from acting, from decarbonizing our civilization. And so you see efforts to delay action by using soothing words like adaptation. We can just adapt to climate change, says Marco Rubio, a senator from the state of Florida. And I guess what he's telling his constituents is that they need to grow fins and gills, because that's the only way that we could truly adapt to the inundation of the Florida coastline and many other coastal regions of the world from sea level rise, from melting ice sheets, sea level rise. We see similar words from Scott Morrison, the fossil fuel friendly Prime Minister of Australia. And again, they don't deny that climate change is real, but they say the solution is adaptation, resilience, anything but cutting our usage of fossil fuels. Geoengineering. Why don't we just interfere with the global climate system, shoot particles into the stratosphere, dump iron into the ocean, do these other things in a hope that they might offset the warming effect of increasing carbon pollution? What could possibly go wrong? Well, suffice it to say that the Koch brothers actually provided funding for a public broadcasting service, PBS, special last year, documentary last year about geoengineering. There's a report coming out within the next couple of days from the US National Academy of Sciences about geoengineering. It's getting a lot of attention. It's promoted by Bill Gates in his new book about climate change. Well, there are two basic problems here. One is that you want to be careful screwing around with a planet a planetary system that you don't understand perfectly, especially when there's no other choice. There is no planet B. And many of these schemes come with potentially dangerous, disastrous, unintended consequences. But it also provides what's sometimes called a moral hazard. The idea that we might have this techno fix that we could deploy, say, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, is used by some special interests to argue that we can continue with our profligate burning of fossil fuels because we've got this techno fix down the road that we can implement if we need to. And so it is used by fossil fuel interests as a crutch to allow us to continue, again, to remain addicted to fossil fuels, to continue to burn fossil fuels and generate carbon pollution. Deflection. And I won't go into the details of this. This is an approach that has been used by industry campaigns in the past. The beverage industry didn't want to see bottle bills pass in the various states that would put a deposit on bottles and cans, requiring that they be reprocessed, returned to the bottling companies, the beverage companies like Coca-Cola, Anheuser-Busch. They would be responsible for processing these returned bottles and cans. It would deal with the accumulating bottle and can litter, but it would hurt their bottom line. It would hurt their profits. So instead, they engaged in a massive public relations campaign that even fooled many environmentalists. The famous Crying Indian commercial that was all about us cleaning up the environment, empowering kids like me. I was 6 years old at the time, and I remember feeling empowered by this advertisement, this public service announcement. This poor Native American, Cody, a tear going down his face because of the bottle and can litter, drawing upon the powerful sort of mythology of our Native people that was part of the zeitgeist of the early 1970s, exhorting us to clean up our environment. And it seemed empowering, and some environmental organizations signed on to it initially, till they realized they'd been had and they backed out. It was a massive public relations campaign by Coca-Cola and the beverage industry, hashed on Madison Avenue to divert attention from systemic solutions, from the need for bottle bills, and instead say, we just need people to pick up their bottle and can litter. We don't need regulation. We don't need a systemic solution to this problem. Thanks to their successful efforts, we have one of the other great global environmental threats that we face today, the global plastic pollution problem. Well, the fossil fuel industry saw that and said, we like that. We're going to run with that ourselves. And so it isn't a coincidence that British Petroleum in the early 2000s gave us the first widely used carbon footprint calculator. That came from British Petroleum. You could calculate your own individual carbon footprint because they wanted us so focused on our individual carbon footprints that we didn't pay any attention to theirs. 70% of global carbon emissions are due to 100 polluting companies. They wanted to deflect attention away from that and the need for systemic solutions like carbon pricing, subsidies for renewable energy to level the playing field, the blocking of additional fossil fuel infrastructure. They didn't want any of that. So they've worked hard to make it all about just you and me and us changing our diet, traveling less, etc. Doing things that, of course, we should do, but they aren't ultimately the solution to the problem. Individual behavioral change alone isn't going to get us the reductions that we need. We need systemic changes. We need to decarbonize our entire societal infrastructure, and that requires policy. That's deflection. Then there's division. Take opinion leaders like our special envoy on climate here in the United States under Joe Biden, John Kerry, and accuse him of being a hypocrite because he uses air travel. It accomplishes three things. It deflects attention away, once again, from the needed systemic solutions to personal behavior. It also divides the community. If you get climate advocates arguing with each other about their individual behavior. What's more personal than our behavioral choices, our lifestyle choices, whether you're vegan, whether you fly. They get us finger pointing and carbon shaming each other, and it divides the community of climate advocates. So we no longer speak with a unified voice demanding action, demanding change. And it's used to discredit some of our key messengers and thought leaders like John Kerry or Leonardo DiCaprio or Al Gore. It isn't a coincidence that you see Fox News, the Murdoch media empire, attacking those individuals, accusing them of hypocrisy, because it's actually playing into 3 different new climate war tactics at the same time: division, deflection, and discrediting. And we even see friendly fire, liberal art icons, a Canadian, by the way, and he's done a lot of good stuff, Michael Moore. Canadian Bacon was a great film. If you've never seen it before, it was actually directed by Michael Moore. It's pretty interesting. Michael Moore, who's this liberal icon, put out a film last year, Planet of the Humans, that vilified renewable energy. And environmental advocates are, what is Michael Moore doing? What's going on? Well, we still haven't figured it out. Nobody knows why he chose to target the one obvious solution to climate change, shifting away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. We don't know why he did it, but we know who liked the message, because his film wasn't promoted by any major environmental distributors. He couldn't get any major distributors to run the film, any environmental organizations to support it, or to even promote it. Who did promote it? It was the Koch brothers funded fossil fuel front group, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Heartland Institute, another fossil fuel front group, Breitbart News, the Murdoch media empire. They loved this film. Friendly fire, dividing the community by even getting progressive icons to attack renewable energy. And then finally, you notice there's some alliterations: deflection, there's division, there is doomism and despair mongering. Once again, and I alluded to this before, if they can convince us it's too late to do anything about the problem, it potentially leads us down that same path of inaction, of disengagement, as outright denial. And again, they don't care about the path we take. They just care about the destination. They want us disengaged, not calling for change. And whether it's because we deny that climate change is even occurring, or we don't think we can do anything about it anymore, it leads us potentially down that same path of disengagement. And the science is very clear. We can still avert the worst impacts of climate change if we act boldly now. And ironically, this sort of reasoning, despair mongering, doom mongering, could be self-fulfilling, because if we allow it to take hold, then we might not make the changes necessary to avert catastrophic climate change impacts. So what do we need to do finally? And I'm running long to win the war here. Urgency and agency. Yes, there's great urgency. We have to act now. We've already seen that. The impacts are upon us. Dangerous climate change has already arrived by some measure. If you're Puerto Rico, if you're Alberta, the wildfires you've seen in recent summers, if you're the west coast of the US, if you're Australia, by some measure, dangerous climate change has arrived. And at this point, it's a matter of how bad we're willing to let it get. And we've seen that we need to bring carbon emissions down dramatically to avert a truly catastrophic warming of more than 1.5, let alone 2 degrees Celsius warming. So there's great urgency, but there is agency. There is still time to make the changes necessary, to take the action necessary to avert catastrophic warming. And I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because we don't need a miracle. Bill Gates, again, he has a book out, he downplays the role that renewable energy can play. He ends up promoting nuclear energy and geoengineering. If you really don't think that we can get there through renewables alone, and there's actually very convincing scientific evidence, there are peer-reviewed studies that show we can. Using existing renewable energy technology, we can get 80% of our economy, of our energy decarbonized by 2030, can meet 100% of projected energy demand by 2050 from renewables alone. So we have the solutions now. We don't need a miracle. We don't need new technology. We don't need geoengineering. And the obstacles aren't physical. They're not technological. We have the technology. Bill Gates was recently asked in an interview, he was asked about the politics of climate change. And he said, I don't know the solution to the politics of climate change. You know, there's this saying, if your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if you're a technocrat, every problem looks like a technological problem. But this isn't a technological problem in this case. It is a political problem. It's a matter of willpower, collective willpower, political pressure. And if you don't know the solution to the politics, you don't know the solution to the problem. You better move over and make room for folks who do recognize that we can solve this problem if we can organize, if we can see the collective action necessary to force the hands of our policy makers to act before it's too late. And we're seeing some good data. We're seeing numbers come in. Global carbon emissions have plateaued. They're no longer going up. Last year, they came down, in fact. At their peak in March, they were down 7%. They were down 17%. By the time the year was over, it was a 7% drop. We saw global carbon emissions come down about 7% last year. That's the good news. We can do it. We can reduce carbon emissions by 7% in a year. And if we do it by 7% next year and the year after and the year after that, we remain on a path to limiting warming below that catastrophic 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we can do it. It's clear. That's the good news. The bad news is that much of that reduction did come from temporary social distancing, lockdown, economic slowdown, decreased transportation, the response to the pandemic. And that's a fleeting effect. And if we don't structurally change our economy, we're not going to be able to continue to achieve those reductions. So yes, we can do it, but changes in lifestyle, in behavior, temporary measures like we've seen during the lockdown, those alone aren't going to be necessary. We need to decarbonize our economy. We need policies that incentivize that. The good news is we're starting to see that. China has carbon pricing and it's making a difference. We're seeing now under Joe Biden, this shift in the political winds, a positive shift in the political winds, the boldest executive actions we've ever seen from an incoming president on climate by the Biden administration, incorporating climate policy into every agency, into every division of our government, and a Congress that may in fact be in position now to bring a climate bill to the floor of the Senate for a vote. And we could actually see climate legislation finally in the United States that will complement the executive actions that we're seeing under the Biden administration. But more important than anything else, the US is back. The Biden administration is taking a leadership role globally on climate, and that's changing the tone. It's putting pressure on other intransigent actors like Australia. Even Scott Morrison has changed his tune quite a bit over the last month or so because he feels that pressure of the United States, the world's largest net cumulative emitter of carbon, now once again taking a leadership role. And I think that changes the playing field dramatically. And it does put us in position now to see the sorts of actions that will be necessary if we are to avert a catastrophic warming of the planet. And then finally, the youth climate movement, which is at the very beginning, we heard some words about the importance of our children and grandchildren. And to me, that's really what this is about. Our ethical obligation not to destroy this planet for future generations. And Greta Thunberg and the youth climate protesters around the world have really recentered this conversation where it needed to be all along. It's not just about the science, the economics, the policy, It's about the ethics, our ethical obligation, again, not to leave behind a degraded planet for our children and grandchildren. And there's still time to make sure that that is not our legacy. So I will leave it there. I look forward to some discussion. I will stop my share.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Doctor. Going back to the lockdown and COVID, as I was saying to you before the show, this show, the whole idea of a climate of change was that maybe this COVID moment was something that was going to help facilitate people starting to think about the way we're doing things, and that climate could be something that starts to be more top of mind for folks.
Yeah.
For myself, I remember the lockdown. I think about looking out a window. I'm in the downtown Calgary at the quietest Calgary that I'd ever seen. And, thinking that all over the world, people are in one way or another looking out that window. And the thought that came to me was, the prime thought that I had at that moment was, well, you can't tell us that we can't do big things together. You can't say that to us anymore. We all decided we were going to go into lockdown that first time, and lockdown we went. And that was one of the big teachable moments that I felt like the world could not unsee. What was your prime thought specifically during that first lockdown?
Yeah, and in the final chapter of the book, I spend a fair amount of time talking about the lessons that we can draw from the pandemic. But I'll be honest, you could write a whole book.
I was just thinking that you could absolutely write a whole book. Yes,
you could write a whole book about the lessons that we can take, and there's so many obvious lessons about sort of our fragility on this planet. Right, a microscopic organism can turn our world upside down. I think it teaches us some humility. It gives us a sense of fragility, the fragility of nearly 8 billion people on a planet with finite space and food and water. And I think it opens up, I hope. And so the carbon emissions reductions from the lockdown, a lot of that will be temporary. But I think what you're alluding to is there may be a permanent effect, a psychological impact that this has. It changes the conversation. It opens up a conversation about some broader questions about, environmental sustainability. Can we live sustainably on this planet, in the framework of a, extraction-based global economy? Is that consistent with environmental sustainability? We have to start asking some of these broader questions. There's an argument to be made that, market capitalism in its current form may not be compatible with environmental sustainability. And I think we've got to confront that possibility. But in the meantime, we're not going to remake the global economy in the next 10 years. I don't think we're going to see capitalism go away in the next 10 years. And as we saw, we need to solve this problem within the next 10 years. So to me, we've got to work within the system that exists now to reduce our carbon emissions. We need to take advantage of market mechanisms for reducing carbon emissions because that's the system we're in. Canada is using that effectively. Australia used carbon pricing very effectively until the conservative government came in and got rid of it. Mm-hmm. And it can be done in a way that's just, and that's really important as well. Carbon pricing doesn't have to fall inordinately on frontline communities. That's one of the concerns that if we're not careful in how we implement it, that it will end up hurting frontline low-income families, low-income earners, but it can be done in a progressive way. That's what Canada is really doing, and that's what Australia actually did. But I'm getting a little bit off topic. The pandemic, it also taught us a lesson about the importance of listening to what science has to offer us. We saw in the space of a few months, and in that initial period, you ask about that first sort of lockdown, what we saw was that those countries that didn't listen to public health experts saw escalating deaths. And those that did were able to get the problem somewhat under control. New Zealand and Australia, where I was at the beginning of the pandemic, did a much better job than the United States. The United States, we had a president who refused to listen to public health officials, who demonized them. We had the Murdoch media empire demonize them. It was the same sort of anti-science, ideologically anti-science that we've seen deployed against climate science for decades. Mm-hmm. We saw it now deployed here against public health science as well. It wasn't Mike Mann being vilified by Rupert Murdoch and News Corp. It was Anthony Fauci, because the message that he was carrying was inconvenient to the interests of Donald Trump and the Republicans who had hoped that he would be reelected. So it taught us that science denial is deadly, and we can measure that toll literally in hundreds of thousands of human lives over the course of this pandemic here in the United States. That was the cost. That was the deadliness of the rejection of what the scientific community had to say. And here's the irony. We will lose far greater numbers of lives in the future if we fail to act on the climate crisis. Right. The pandemic will largely be in our rearview mirror a year from now, although many of us have friends, family members that we will lose. I mean, it's a tragedy, and we won't fully recover from that tragedy, but the acute threat will be behind us with the vaccine. And looming there in front of us, ever larger, will be the climate crisis.
You know, you talk about measuring the cost and you know, hoping that people recognize the science. If there's a whole book to be written on the comparison between COVID and climate, there's a chapter here in Alberta that writes itself. So we had, as we were going into fall of last year, we had a provincial government that the best non-partisan way I can say it was reluctant to put in any controls in place and put a very high prevalence on personal responsibility. And your book is very much about that effort to put personal responsibility on folks instead of doing anything big about the thing. And what I can tell you is you've got those numbers now. So we can see that going into the fall, our COVID numbers were getting really, really bad, to the effect that the hospitals we were becoming a model for what goes wrong with when you don't flatten the curve.
Yeah.
And finally, it was like, we're halfway through December, we're approaching Christmas. And that's when we went into lockdown between Christmas and New Year's. We had to do it. And what you can see from those numbers are, it goes up, personal responsibility, and then government controls, boom. And that's it.
That's right.
You can't unsee it.
That's right.
So you hope everybody takes the right lessons from it. There's a few lessons. There's a great number of lessons you can learn from not just COVID and climate, but Alberta COVID and climate.
And just one quick follow-up on that. And it also drives home the importance, the point that both are important. Personal behavior is important in limiting the spread of the disease.
Right.
And personal behavioral change is important in dealing with the climate crisis. We should all reduce our carbon footprint. It saves us money, makes us healthier, sets a good example for other people. Of course, we should do these things, but what we can't allow it to be is a substitute for the needed systemic changes in policies. Right. And I think there's an analogy there as well.
So I read your book thoroughly, and I've had the great fortune of interviewing some really smart people over the last year.
Well, sorry to disappoint you.
Well, what I was going to say is there's a few of those books where I refer to them as texts now, because this is something that I'll be able to go back to quite frequently as we're still battling out the forces of resistance and inaction and all of that. With one of the thoughts that occurs to me is that really the new climate war isn't as much a new climate war as it's the old climate war, because all of those tactics were there. The thing that makes it a new climate war is that they no longer have climate denialism as a tactic.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So now there's a greater prevalence, not just a prevalence, but a reliance on the other tactics. Yeah. And, it makes me wonder, what are the next tactics that might fall the same way as as climate denial or science denial went. So, and I'm wondering if the personal responsibility canard might be the next to go down in relation to COVID. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I agree with that interpretation. These things were always there, no question about it. It's just that the preferred approach was outright denial when it was credible. And when that no longer was credible, what you were left with was these other tactics. And so they were scaled up in importance, and they have been magnified, just as you say. My feeling is that all of those things, I don't necessarily think that these are like pillars that each have to fall independently. I think the entire ecosystem of sort of inactivism is going to collapse as we act, right? As we act, it all becomes irrelevant. If Americans and if Canadians, if everyone else decides, look, we're going to act now because we know we have a problem, and we've done it before. We've seen past examples where we did rise to the occasion with ozone depletion, with acid rain. We've also seen some really important societal tipping points here in the United States on marriage equality. We're going through a societal tipping point right now on issues of cultural and racial justice. And I think the next tipping point is the climate, not the climate tipping points we fear, the physical climate tipping points.
The cultural tipping point.
Cultural tipping point. And I think we're getting very close to that. And there's some interesting social science research. I talk a little bit about it in the book, in what does allow for those societal tipping points. And if you look at the numbers, if you look at the polling, we seem pretty well situated now to potentially have that tipping point. Basically, you need at least 25% of the population that sees this as the primary challenge, that it's their number one issue. And when that happens, there's a possibility of seeing a sudden transformation in how society writ large views that problem. And I think we're nearing that with climate. So I think all of those tactics become irrelevant if they don't work. And they won't work if we decide to move on.
You know what will be a good indicator is I'm waiting for that hashtag. Me Too, it started as a hashtag. Black Lives Matter, the first I've heard of it was a hashtag. Occupy Wall Street. Take down that flag about the Confederate flag in the South. It's always about this hashtag that people build around, and I haven't seen it yet, but we'll know it when we see it.
Yeah, there are hashtags in the social media climate space, but there isn't one, as you say, one galvanizing hashtag that captures the entire movement. And maybe the
hashtag just. So switching tacks a little bit here. There's looking at the climate timeline, as I mentioned earlier, there have been a lot of great big things that have happened. It's easy for so many of us to focus on the negative. And that's one of the things I like about your book is like, it's okay to be positive about this. I'm thinking, I think a really big thing that I haven't heard a lot of folks talk about yet, and I'd be interested in your response to is, America signs the Paris Climate Agreement. A month and a half later, whatever it is, at the World Economic Forum, the world's economists come together. They call it a $1 trillion opportunity, the transition to a clean energy future. And for the first time, using the terms $1 trillion opportunity instead of, crisis and everything is terrible and suffer. Right. And then China goes heavy on solar, and the ramifications of that we're still feeling. Solar is now within it's now a thing where it's easy to make the economic case.
Absolutely.
And now that America is laying down you are one of the voices that I look to say, am I right here? Is this a bona fide, legit, big, bad, awesome plan? And you seem very, very bullish on it as well.
On the Biden plan, yeah.
And so I guess can we expect with America going hard on climate for the same thing that happened with China and solar to happen to like everything else on climate if America goes serious on it, and we take the rest of the world at their word when they say they want to build back better?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the United States, we're basically going to meet our Paris commitments, having had absolutely no leadership. In fact, we had the opposite. We had Donald Trump trying to reverse policies that the previous administration had put in place to deal with climate. So despite not just the absence of a tailwind, but a headwind at the national level, there was enough going on at the state level. I mean, California alone is the world's 5th largest economy. So you got California on board, you've got the West Coast states on board, you've got the Mid-Atlantic states. Pennsylvania is part of RGGI, this consortium of New England and Mid-Atlantic states that are committed to climate policies. So 30% of the American population right now is already in a state that is committed to things like carbon pricing and subsidizing renewable energy and sort of clean energy portfolio policies. That is in the absence of any leadership at the national level. So now imagine what happens when you've got a chief executive whose agenda is aligned with what the states are doing and with what a lot of companies are doing and with what citizens are doing. I think we have that alignment now. And, that, as I said, towards the end of the talk, more than anything else, more even than the domestic policies, is the fact that the US is now sort of taking a leadership role in the global conversation. And Biden is bringing, the rest of the world's nations together here on Earth Day in the United States as sort of a preparatory meeting to make sure that we've got our act together going into Glasgow at the end of the year, the next conference of the parties. And so I feel quite confident that we are going to see a major ratcheting up of the United States' commitment under Paris, of China's commitment under Paris, and as goes China and the US, the world's 2 largest emitters, goes the rest of the world. There are going to be a few bad apples. Saudi Arabia isn't going to be, it will remain an intransigent actor. Russia is a petrostate, and they have been adverse in their policies to global climate action. They've actually tried to interfere with other countries' efforts to implement domestic climate action. They did that through social media in Canada. We're doing that in Australia, here in the United States. So yeah, there are a few bad apples, but when you've got the US on board, when you've got China on board, then I think you do see that tipping point. And, so it remains to be seen. We've got to see what those commitments are. And the US and China have not yet put forward their new Paris commitment, but there's a lot of pressure on both to really ratchet up those commitments. And if we do that, we're already halfway to stabilizing warming below 2 degrees. So one can easily imagine a ratcheting up of commitments that will align us with a 2-degree warming, which is pretty good. Of course, we would really like to get those commitments up to the point where we limit warming below 1.5 C. We're not there yet. That's going to require even more work.
So we're sticking with some big picture questions here. With all of that going on, a fellow with an overly positive mind, which about 50% of the time is me, can imagine that it's possible that we are in the preambles of a renaissance. If you think about all of the different countries coming together and fixing this and creating new energy, and there's many fine renaissances have been created out of less. At the same time, we have populism, we have fascism, we have white supremacy on the rise, and is that the last gasp of the broken and backwards, like the darkness before the dawn, or is it crazy to think that we might be currently right now in a renaissance? We just don't even know it yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's the old adage, you can see the glass half full or half empty. We can see some of the good things that are happening right now in the United States. This sort of this there's a renaissance right now taking place when it comes to issues of cultural racism and our views about that and our commitment to acting on it and to trying to eliminate those historic inequalities. And so there is a movement underway in that direction, but there is also this stiff opposition in the form of, it was the storming of the Capitol. That really represented, to me, was almost a resurgence of the Civil War. It's this sort of last gasp, if you will, of the Old South and of all of the backward views that go with that. It's still there. It's still fighting back. I think it will lose, but that is the battle that we're having right now. And it is, it is a Tolkien-esque battle between good and evil that is taking place. And as happens in Lord of the Rings, I think that good will win out in that battle, but it won't be pretty. And we've seen how ugly it can get, and we're not past that yet, but we're going to get past it.
And power never gives up anything for nothing. So that's part of the challenge. Switching over to here in Alberta, I describe, we're here with the City of Calgary's Climate Symposium. I often describe Calgary as ground zero for the climate crisis in Canada. And here in Alberta, there's a lot of tendency to see you're either pro oil and gas or pro climate, and there is some enforced division that goes on from some of the higher ups, I think. But I'm conscious of the fact that there's so much that our province has going for it. I don't know if to what degree you've paid attention to what we have going on or what the potential that we have. But I mean, we're a geothermal hotbed. We actually have orphaned oil wells, not all of them, but some of them could be turned into geothermal tomorrow. Right. We have amongst the best solar profiles here in Calgary and all of Canada. We're connected to one of the most prolific wind corridors moving east to west through the prairies that's on the planet. And we have lithium, so we can provide for solar panels here. Right. And so I'm in a position where I love oil and gas people. They're my friends. They're fun at parties, and we're friends. And I wish them all the best in all things. How do I get them to come over and see how do we get this transition, make this transition happen? It's not,
It's a great question. I think part of it is just sort of the way we engage these folks, and you've had positive engagements with them. They're not the enemy. They're not the villain. They're not. People who work in the industry, in many respects, they've been victims here in the United States, in the coal mines, black lung, the safety violations, these coal barons who make millions of dollars while they ignore the safety violations that ultimately lead to the collapse of coal mines that kill coal workers. And then they shed crocodile tears over it when it happens, and they continue to ignore the warnings that they received. That's really so there are some villains, some of the fossil fuel barons, the coal barons, who have made huge profits at the expense of the people who work in that industry. But the folks that we encounter in our lives who work in that industry, they're and in some respects, let's grant them the fact that they have played a heroic role. We built the great wealth of our nations, Canada and the United States, substantially on cheap energy, fossil fuels. And, they replaced something that was worse. We used to hunt whales for their oil back in the 1800s, and something better came along. It was the fossil fuels. And now something better than that has come along. That's renewable energy. And so we have to transition. And we have to make sure that those, folks that folks aren't left behind in the transition, that we provide opportunities for them. And that's one of the things that the Biden, the array of executive actions that they're putting forward really recognizes that. It recognizes that we have to help people in those communities, in those fossil fuel communities. They're not villains. They're good people. We need to help them out. We need to provide, revitalization plans. Let's turn these communities into, new hubs of economic activity. Let's hire people. And one of the things I really like about the plan is this idea of a civilian climate corps, where we're going to hire people to remediate many of those brownfields and, the degraded lands from, decades of fossil fuel extraction. Let's hire people to remediate that and to implement, natural carbon burial. So we can hire those folks to help fix the problem that the industry, not so much them, but their industry created. And more than anything else, though, I think you go a long way to sort of healing the wounds in this conversation by simply acknowledging that these folks aren't bad people. They're not the enemy. They've been used and exploited by some bad actors, but the workers, I teach these kids, here in Pennsylvania, it's a fossil fuel state. It's where we found oil in the country. It was built on coal, and now natural gas is a big part of the economy. And I teach kids, I lecture to kids who come from those, coal families, and they're good kids, and their families are good families. Let's help them out. And their families want to see them go on and go on to careers elsewhere. They want to see them move on and not be part of a dying industry, but part of, what replaces it.
So, as I've mentioned a few times now, we are a part of the City of Calgary's Climate Symposium. I know that we have a few political leaders and folks from across the spectrum of this city paying attention to this show tonight. What's your advice to our city? I mean, I can tell you that we have for quite a long time seen oil and gas, for good reason, as the backbone, our economic backbone. And in fact, a lot of the buildings you look at and a lot of the gorgeous things we have here, you can lay directly at oil and gas's door. And so, we should always be cognizant of that.
Right.
But what advice do you have for our city tonight, Dr. Mann?
Yeah, well, I think you sort of alluded to it. You have other great natural resources, sun, wind, and you do have some of those, the mining metals that are needed in construction of clean energy infrastructure. Look, ultimately, there are far more potential jobs in installing renewable energy, in deploying and installing renewable energy than there are in fossil fuel energy, which is largely automated. It's a largely automated industry. There aren't that many jobs. Even the much touted Keystone XL pipeline, the idea that will bring jobs. It'll bring a number of temporary jobs, but permanent jobs, maybe 100. And there's so many more potential jobs in renewable energy. And as you point to, Alberta is a logical place for it, given the other resources you have, the wind, the solar, the geothermal. It's sort of like, I don't know, you're sort of like our Texas. Texas.
Yeah. No, that's legit. And I would mention and remind my city and my province tonight that some of those resources aren't just energy. The oil and gas economy that helped build this city and this province. We have a brilliant STEM community. We have great education here. We really
I know there's some great folks at University of Lethbridge. I can tell you
bet.
that. I
shout out to
Lethbridge.
There
Absolutely.
You go.
Yeah.
So there's I mean, on my most hopeful days, I still feel that this city can show leadership to all of Canada and thereby the world on how an oil and gas town shifts to the new stuff and doesn't leave anybody behind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know what it reminds me of? And I see Texas that same way. It's got those resources, it's got the wind, it's got the solar, it can do it. Even T. Boone Pickens, who was a fossil fuel,
Right.
guy, for a time decided to get into wind because he realized the potential in Texas.
Yeah.
And you can feel good about it, right? You're now, it's a great story. It was this fossil fuel, this person who built his career on fossil fuels, on natural gas and oil, now becoming a wind guy. And it reminds me a bit, of the town of Greenburg, Kansas. I don't know if you've heard of the story. It was a town that was leveled by an F5 tornado some years ago in one of the most conservative parts of Kansas, a very conservative Republican mayor who decided to rebuild the town as a sort of paragon of renewable energy, LEED platinum, everything. It was almost like, the phoenix, from the ashes was built something better and greater. And this guy was, the conservative, avuncular, older, mayor, very tall guy, very commanding. I met him at a conference some years ago, and he just realized it was the right thing to do. And it was such a compelling story because it was this conservative town, this Republican mayor who said, hey, let's rebuild this thing. Let's take this as an opportunity and send a message. And that's what Alberta can do. They can send a message by turning the corner, by showing that you can go from a extraction-based fossil fuel economy to a renewable energy economy. That's where the jobs are going to be. You get on board with that earlier, your people are going to be better off, and everybody's going to feel good about what they're doing because they're providing jobs and they're actually working towards the sustainability of our planet.
I couldn't agree more. So I've got a few thank yous I've got to do here, and then we're going to bring in our panelists. It's a question and a follow-up from each of them.
Okay.
So to begin with, this event is a part of the City of Calgary's annual Climate Symposium from March 25th to 26th as an opportunity to open up the conversation about climate change in our city. Connect with community leaders, entrepreneurs, prominent climate experts, and city staff for a series of unique and free learning opportunities. There are a number of great events and speakers over the next few days. You can visit the City of Calgary website and make sure you don't miss a thing. We will be placing links in the chat shortly. I should also mention that tonight's event is a joint presentation and something of a coalition building moment between the Calgary Climate Hub and the Climate Hub of Southern Alberta, and truly couldn't have happened without the work of Professor James Byrne of the University of Lethbridge, who I know Dr. Mann knows quite well. I'll have a little more for you on this coalition building moment / opportunity later in the show. On behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I'd like to take this moment to recognize the support of the Alberta Eco Trust Foundation, whose grant programs have helped bring forward so many great Alberta-specific environmental initiatives, including this broadcast. They're a group of very smart people that care about the right things, and in my humble opinion, they'll only become more and more important to this province as we make the necessary transition to a climate-friendly future. Show is also brought to you in part by the great folks at Skyfire Energy. Skyfire has been a standout leader in solar power for Western Canada for 20 years, designing and installing residential and commercial grid-tied and off-grid solar electric systems. Solar is now more affordable than ever, and even more so with their financing options. Why pay for electricity when you can generate it instead? Get a free quote today at skyfireenergy.com. Do it after the show, though. And finally, before we move on to our guest panelist segment, I'd like to announce our next Climate of Change show coming up on April 14th with the Drawdown Alberta team. Drawdown refers to the point in the future when levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stop climbing and start to steadily decline, thereby stopping catastrophic climate change as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. Drawdown is the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to actually reverse global warming. And what I can tell you is it's a set of hundreds of big solutions for what we face. and doesn't say a single thing about shutting down economies or living like hermits. And that is because it is very much about an all hands on deck retooling and building. I should also mention Drawdown Alberta is a part of your Calgary Climate Symposium tomorrow night at 7 p.m., where you can learn more about the opportunity in climate action. You can find the link to RSVP for tomorrow night's event, as well as our next Climate of Change show with Drawdown Alberta in the chat. How about that, Dr. Mann? Did you know that Drawdown has a team of folks working right here in Alberta?
Yeah, they're all over the place. Drawdown is really, entered very much into the entire consciousness of the climate movement. It's great.
So we're now at the next portion of our show where we have a few guest panelists on to ask some questions. Our first panelist is Laura Sachs. She's the regional organizer for the Community Climate Hub Initiative. She founded and co-leads the Nelson West Kootenay chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby, and is a trained climate reality leader and an En-ROADS climate ambassador. It may take a second or two for her to come up that looks like she's there. Hello there, Laura.
Hello.
I see that she's there, and I don't see the microphone is turned off yet. No.
There we go. Okay. Hi there. Well, that was weird. It just went rejoining meeting.
All right. Well, you're here.
Sorry about that. So here I am. Well, thank you. Well, first I wanted to say I'm calling in from the traditional territory of the Sinixt Tanaha people, and acknowledge their wisdom for many, many millennia keeping this land in habitable form. And yeah, I really wanted to thank you for your book, and I really enjoy those D's, shining the spotlight on and having a language now for being able to, talk about some of these things like doomism and division and things like that, which I think are so important. We see that in the area that I'm in British Columbia here. But the question that I have for you actually is more of a personal one. I am curious about, I guess, how you handle and deal with all of the personal attacks, and starting like way back when you were a young scientist, where you studied science presumably, and not, the social sciences, communication and all of that. So what was that like? And then continuing on, and then if you have any lessons for us on how to stay the course with positive optimism, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's, I sometimes say, there's so many attacks, I barely notice them anymore. It's sort of, at some point, it does sort of bounce off of you because you've seen it all before. You've seen everything they've got to throw at you, and you're still there, you're still standing. And really the way that you succeed, the way that you win in that battle is by not giving up, not allowing them to intimidate you, because that's really what the purpose was of these attacks. And I talk a lot more about that in a previous book. The hockey stick and the climate wars is really more about my personal journey, as you allude to, as a mild-mannered scientist who found myself in the center of this very contentious debate because of the work that we published, and sort of my evolution from sort of a scientist to a public figure and an advocate. And I would say along the way, one of the most important things was to have sort of some senior members of the community that I looked up to so much, like my good friend Stephen Schneider, who's no longer with us. He was a great climate scientist, also a great communicator. And he took me aside when I was still, a young faculty member, when I was just really starting to see the concerted political attacks against me aimed at discrediting the so-called hockey stick curve. And he said, look, they wouldn't be going after you like this if you weren't doing something important. You're hurting their client, the fossil fuel industry, and they're going to try to do everything they can to destroy you. But the way you prevail is by not letting them win, and by fighting on, and by using that platform that they give you to try to pivot and provide a positive message moving forward. And so that's sort of what I tried to do. I was a public figure now, whether I liked it or not. I was in the spotlight initially because I was being attacked by these high profile individuals and organizations, and really an entire industry, the fossil fuel industry and the groups that advocate for them. They provided me a platform, and I decided, well, I'm going to use it. And I'm going to try to become as effective as I can be as a communicator, because, you know, if you're given a platform and you don't take advantage of it, well, then that's a lost opportunity. So I worked to become as effective an advocate as I could, both for the science, but for the notion of an informed public discourse, an informed policy discourse. And I never looked back. And, you know, I would like to thank my detractors. I would like to thank the organizations and the front groups and the individuals who attacked me and the hockey stick the way they did decades ago. Because if they hadn't done that, then I wouldn't be in the position that I'm now in to potentially inform this conversation about the greatest challenge that we face. I feel privileged to be in that position, even though it's not what I signed up for. I had no idea when I double majored in applied math and physics at UC Berkeley and went off to graduate school in physics that I would end up being at the center of the most contentious societal debate we've ever had. But I have come to not only appreciate, but feel privileged to be in that position. And I try to sort of to serve the same role that people like Steve Schneider did. You know, when I was sort of coming up through this, younger scientists who find themselves subject to attacks and Freedom of Information Act requests and efforts at intimidation and politicians going after them. I'd like to draw upon my experiences and try to help them. And I've helped actually, you know, I've helped create some organizations now that exist to help scientists in that position, like the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. There's now a legal defense fund to help scientists who find themselves assailed in this way by industry special interests. And so I'm pretty, you know, that may be one of the things I'm proudest of, is helping provided an infrastructure so that other scientists now feel protected as they come into this space, because that's what's so important. If we allow our detractors to win, if we allow the efforts at intimidation to be successful, then it chills the discourse. It keeps other scientists from coming forward and playing the role that they need to play in informing the conversation.
Well, that's fantastic. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on, Laura. Our next panelist is Sydney Whiting. She's a high school student who was a key organizer for the Lethbridge climate strike and is an active leader in our partner organization for this event, the Climate Hub of Southern Alberta. Sometimes it takes a moment or two for our I think I see Sydney coming through here. I know she's a friend of Jim Burns as well, and so take it away, Sydney.
Hi there.
Hi there.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation, and it's an honor to be able to speak with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. My question is kind of in context of being a young person, fairly new to this movement and to these discussions. But young people often have these mounting concerns about the future of industry and job prospects as a direct result of climate change. And as you mentioned in your book, more and more people are turning to online forums or social media to raise awareness, voice these concerns for their future, and participate in the climate discourse. Young people care about these issues and they care about solutions, but I find, and in talking with peers, it can often be difficult to extend that beyond just the actions on social media. And so how do you suggest mobilizing this online group and kind of tapping into this energy. And for those in that group, making the jump between being a digital supporter and lobbying for real systemic change.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. And, it is so important. Social media is a primary means of communication and engagement. And we have to take full advantage of that, knowing that there are some perils and there's some bad actors out there that are trying to sow discord and get us arguing with each other. Bot armies that are deployed, by some nebulous groups, shall we say, to create conflict. And so we have to be resistant to that, and we have to be supportive of each other. And, there is this challenge that you're alluding to of how do we sort of move from digital space into physical space, I guess is sort of a way of thinking about it. And it's a real challenge in the age of the pandemic because we're all almost sort of stuck in digital space. So how do we move beyond the sort of informal engagement in Twitter, social media, to more formal engagement, banding together into groups with actionable targets and goals? I guess, that's sort of, I like to think that one of the silver linings of sort of this digital world we've been forced into by the pandemic is that there are some great tools, online discussions, Zoom, conversations where you can interact with, other young folks from all over the world and certainly all over the country. And the thing that connects you isn't your physical proximity, it's your common interest and your common goals. And so I think that that's empowering. And I see a lot of that. I see a lot of online activism, various fora. I know I did an interview the other day with a couple young folks from Citizens Against Plastics. It's a youth group that is raising awareness about the global plastic pollution problem, but it intersects the climate problem as well. The Fridays for Future sort of effort has been really effective at going online. So I would say in the near term, while we're still sort of mostly stuck in in digital space, to take advantage of those sorts of opportunities to join with others and to begin to plan for actual physical actions, marches, what have you, that will come soon enough as the vaccines are deployed. We're going to return to something that somewhat resembles, I don't know if it will exactly resemble, but it will somewhat resemble what the way things were before the pandemic. So let's make sure that we prepare to hit the ground running when that happens, that we're already organized, we're ready, we're just waiting for that opportunity to move from digital space to physical space and get out there and flood the streets and command the attention of the media and take advantage of the tailwind that we now have. Again, with sort of a return of leadership in the United States, all of these factors are aligning. And I think that when we come out of the pandemic, we're going to have this amazing opportunity to take advantage of all the organizing we've been doing in the meantime. So I don't know if that quite addresses your question.
No, yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. And I agree. It's going to be an interesting transition. It was going into the pandemic, but then as well coming out of it for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess a quick follow-up to the points you raised as well, and kind of what we see trending on social media, I guess, is definitely the focus on individual action and lifestyle changes as opposed to the systemic change. Coming out of that trend line, I guess, I would wonder if you have any strategies to suggest for engaging in discourse with peers or other young people for getting involved in policy action or large scale action that can target when you were talking about the statistics of the 100 largest polluters contributing to 70% of our emissions, how we can put the focus on that instead of trust on the individual, even though we're important.
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess when I look at some of the sort of figures in the youth climate movement, like Greta Thunberg, I see both of those things, right? I see Greta, does everything she can, literally, to minimize her own environmental and carbon footprint, and that sets a great example for other people. She clearly doesn't just talk the talk; she walks the walk, or sails the boat, as it were, across the Atlantic to go to the New York Climate Summit. But that's not all she's doing. And there's a lot of attention that's paid to that. And I even allude to that in the book. I think sometimes people want to only pay attention to that side of her message and not pay attention to the more inconvenient side of her message for the power brokers and for the forces of inaction, because she is taking them to task. She is taking to task climate change denying politicians and opinion leaders and investment managers. When she in Davos, she was really taking all of these people to task. Why are you the most, you are the leaders, of policy right now in the world. Why aren't you addressing the greatest problem, the greatest threat that we face? And so what I think makes Greta so effective is she does both. She walks the walk. She does all those things that she can do in her individual, in her own life to minimize her carbon footprint, but she's taking the politicians and opinion leaders to task and demanding, not just taking them to task, because I think you need both carrot and stick. It's an old expression. The carrot is the incentive, and the stick is the disincentive. And you have to disincentivize bad behavior, but you also have to provide some incentive for good behavior. So it's important to do both. But she really is holding policymakers accountable too. And I think she's so effective because she's doing both of those things. And I see the youth climate movement writ large as really focused on both of those things. But I do think there's some people who want to make it only about the individual actions. And sometimes they do that to sort of belittle Greta. It's like, well, look at that mess that they made, and look at the plastic that was used to make that boat that she's traveling on. It sort of makes it very easy for them to try to undermine her credibility when they focus only on her individual behavior. And they want to ignore the fact that she is taking the inactivists to task too.
Yeah, and it's inspiring to see someone my own age also taking up arms in such a large capacity. So thank you so much.
It isn't just Greta. There's so many of you out there. That's what makes it so great. I mean, we talk so much about Greta, but what makes this so amazing is it's a movement, millions of people around the world who march in every city that's what makes it so powerful. It is the voice of our youth demanding change. And, I think that there is a moral clarity and purity of that is extremely powerful, and it has changed the whole game.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on, Sydney. And, I'm just going to add a point here, to the youth groups that are trying to figure out what comes next when we come out of lockdown and all of that. And in fact, I know there are a number of folks from climate hubs across the country paying attention tonight. And what I would say is that this is a unique moment in human history. And, when things open back up, they will be looking to stimulate economies. They will be looking to create jobs programs. And it's critical that we don't rebuild broken systems and that we build the right stuff. I think every climate organization on the planet should be focusing everything they got on that due to the moment.
Absolutely. That could be a really important part of the messaging as those demonstrations and marches take place again. Absolutely.
My final question for you before I do a few closing notes here is just the Calgary Climate Hub. We do a lot of things at the municipal level, and we do a lot of things in individual communities. I personally do a set of community events in communities across Calgary. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask you if there were certain policies or solutions that you really like at the community level.
Yeah, thanks so much. Because I mean, that's part of what's kept us going, right? Like I said, the absence of any leadership in the United States at the national level meant that we needed leadership everywhere else, from the grassroots all the way up to as far as we could get. We couldn't get to the White House. We couldn't get to Congress, but we could get to state houses. We could, impact states and groups of states that are banding together, but companies, but also municipalities and cities and towns. And it starts, policy starts at that granular level. Here in State College, Pennsylvania, where I live, we have some really enlightened local political leaders who have made sure to try to create incentives for renewable energy, to encourage Penn State to be, because we're the largest energy user in the area, and to put pressure on Penn State, for example, to move away from its own fossil fuel infrastructure. And they're doing it. So in part because of the grassroots pressure and the pressure of local politicians. The university is now, I would say they have been brought a ways from where we were, say, 10 years ago, when from my office in the Walker Building in Penn State, I was looking out on a coal-fired power plant that was generating most of the electricity that was being used by Penn State University. That power plant has been shut down. And we are now building a large solar array. So that's happening at the local level, and at the local level, influencing some of the big actors. In this case, in our community, it's Penn State. Where you are, it would be other businesses and universities, University of Lethbridge, of course, part of that as well. So, it comes from having enlightened local political leadership that puts pressure on local institutions. And then you're building action from the ground up, and you build that as high as you can get. The good news now is we've now reached the national level. We now have a president, an administration that's acting in alignment with what the states and municipalities are doing. And maybe we'll even get some climate legislation out of this Congress.
That would be a wonderful thing. And Canada does end up following a lot of leads like that when that happens. You know what? We did skip over one panelist there, and I'm sorry about that. Our final panelist is Deandra Brewsted. She's previously the Kainai Band Climate Change Coordinator and is now an elected member of the Kainai Governing Council. Deandra, it's wonderful to have you on tonight's show. The floor is yours.
I love the buffalo and the wind turbine.
Was that what that is? Yeah, okay. Deandra, do we have you? There we go.
Hey, Oki.
Hi.
Okay, Nishakoa. Idami Chisiko, Dr. Mann.
Hi.
Mr. Goki Dump Sargatsi. Nimkto to Ogano. Nimkto Titabi Mamyoix, Gi Agapogax. Yeah, honestly, Laura and Sydney asked really great questions that were very much along mine. So, but I did want to kind of maybe have a short discussion with you on a few of the missing gaps that I think I've heard in this conversation. So a little bit of a context in this is, talking about the hockey stick and the increased rise in carbon dioxide, right, attached to the rising heat, but that's also in line with colonization here in North America and Canada, right? And that changed an entire economic system. You mentioned earlier in presentation that we don't have 10 years to change an entire system, but it has been done. It was done, but it was done with taking, buffalo off of the plains and taking the people, putting them in residential schools and on First Nations reserves. However, taking the buffalo off the plains takes out a huge portion of carbon sinks and the mechanisms behind carbon sinks. And then as we see with this pandemic, it is actually directly related or connected to natural habitat loss. and then so there's just so many parallels behind climate change and environmental racism. Fossil fuel industry is so major, and there's so many tailing ponds and oil fields that are just near First Nations reserves.
Right.
And now we are seeing here in Alberta, our eastern slopes of the Rockies are threatened because of coal mines. Coal mines, not for burning, however, but for creating steel, right. Which now has the argument that it's for renewable technology or whatever, right? We need steel for materials. So we see this colonized mindset, this root of climate change. That is also the root of the racism. It's the root of the opioid epidemic here in Lethbridge, here in Southern Alberta. It's very individualistic. How do we take that on? How do we face that mindset? You know, we're talking about good communications and good verbiage, and absolutely, but how do we really take that on?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. This is a really important element of the conversation, and we didn't really quite give it justice in the discussion thus far. Issues of environmental racism. A good friend of mine, Bob Bullard, who's sometimes called the father of environmental justice, and he's been speaking as African American from the South, and he's been speaking about this for decades, and nobody was really listening to him. And now there is an audience. People are starting to talk about the intersectionality, right, of this problem, that there are fundamental issues of climate justice that intersect issues of racial justice and economic, cultural justice. And, you know, we're making a little bit of progress. You know, I think here in the United States, a lot of us are very excited that you know, we now have the director of the Department of the Interior, which is responsible for, it's basically the way we use the land of our country is a Native American, Deb Haaland. And it's very exciting because it's the first time it's happened. And it feels like it's the beginning of restoring the rightful order here. The stewards of our land, you know, the rightful stewards of our land have had no real power for way too long. There's so much injustice that it's going to take a long time to really heal all those wounds and undo all of the injustice that's been done. We're making a little bit of progress under the Biden administration. One of the things that they're doing is trying to make sure that most of the funds, or at least 40% of the funds that go into climate related actions, federal government spending on climate mitigation, 40% of that at least will go to frontline communities. You know, but I think you're also talking about something larger here, which is and I sort of hinted at it a little bit, got a little bit into it, is an extraction-based global economy consistent with a sustainable existence on this planet? And I think we all know the answer to that question. It isn't. It ultimately isn't. So we know at some level this has to come to an end. The practices that have got us into all of these, into this mess, created all these problems, and the environmental problems are not separable from the problems of environmental justice and racial justice and cultural justice. As you say, they're all connected, and injustice breeds injustice. And that's part of the problem here. We've got a lot of work to do. Climate change is just one problem, one manifestation of sort of the profligate behavior of our species on this planet. And it's just one dimension, I sometimes say, in this multi-dimensional problem, which is environmental sustainability, living sustainably on this planet. And I think living sustainably on this planet obviously requires getting away from a constant extraction of resources. That's just on a collision course with unsustainability. But it also has to be culturally sustainable, socially sustainable. And that means we have to solve the basic problems of injustice that we face and that we still have. We're making a little bit of progress. It's funny, the Biden administration is of course, infinitely better on all of those issues than what came before it. But that doesn't mean that it's enough. It just means that we're going in the direction we need to be going. But, we've got a foot in the door, but we're not yet all the way through that door. And so, yeah, I think we have to one thing I was going to add, by the way, just as a side note, I don't know if you've by any chance read the book, but I actually talk about sort of the plight of the buffaloes and the symbolism and how that actually played a role in some of the in sort of the zeitgeist of the early 1970s, and there was this very powerful role that Native American, I would almost say mythology. It was an Anglo view of what Native American society was, but there still was this sort of mythical role that it played in our discourse, and there was something that was good about it. There was something good about it. There was a sense of stewardship. There was a sense of what we had before Westerners came to this country and what we've lost.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Mann. And like you mentioned in your answer to Laura, you use your platform, you try and amplify your message. So I like to do the same. And before before this started, I put it out there for our members to ask a question. Yeah. One member had heard you on the radio yesterday, and she just wanted to ask about those geoengineering solutions. So the releasing the silver nitrate for clouds, right, in other countries, is that impacting our climate or I guess the global climate right now? Right, is it, or will it, and what would it look like?
Yeah, so I think, probably what it's getting at is cloud seeding, silver iodide, and there are other sort of chemicals that can be used to provide cloud condensation nuclei. And there have been experiments that have been done. Now, there's a lot of misinformation out there too. There's a lot of, there's sort of conspiracy theories about chemtrails that sometimes get sort of folded into this. But there's a very serious issue, which is that cloud seeding, there's a solid theoretical foundation behind it. Interestingly enough, Kurt Vonnegut, the science fiction writer, his brother Bernard Vonnegut was an atmospheric physicist who worked out a lot of the basic chemistry behind cloud seeding and some of the experiments that were done. It's viable, it can be done, and so it sort of creates some problems. So if cloud seeding can be done, and it really does fold into this larger conversation about geoengineering. So it's worth talking about it. If I can make those clouds precipitate water over my farm, and you're the next farm down, you get screwed. It's good for me, but it's bad for you. It's a zero-sum game to some extent. I got the rain that you otherwise would have got. So there are some real issues about there are obvious issues there about who benefits and who doesn't, and who bears the costs, and what what are the negative impacts of that. And so you can now imagine scale this up to the global scale, where I shoot sulfate particles into the stratosphere to block out some of the sunlight, because it's India, for example, and India is getting really hot, and if we continue on this course, we're going to hit wet bulb temperatures that are too high for human existence, beyond 135 degrees Fahrenheit, and or no, 135 degrees, beyond 35 degrees Celsius, I believe it is. And whatever that is, 90 something Fahrenheit. So I engage in this manipulation of the atmosphere, shoot particles, sulfate particles into the stratosphere to block out sunlight to cool down, my country. But that changes the global atmospheric circulation. It changes large-scale circulation patterns and drought patterns, and somebody else gets a drought because of that. In another country, they suffer the consequences. So to me, these fundamental issues of these issues of who bears the costs and who gets the benefit and who pays the costs is a fundamental problem with geoengineering. Who gets to set the thermostat? Who and how do we? And yeah, I understand that some people want to talk, well, okay, so we need some rules. We need some policies that will guide that. You know what? I think we just have to agree not to do that, to solve this problem the safe way of not continuing to put carbon pollution into the atmosphere. And geoengineering, it's too likely to be used as a crutch for polluters to continue business as usual. So yeah, for some of the same reasons that we understand that cloud seeding creates sort of political problems and problems of jurisdictional problems. Geoengineering does that at the global scale. And so it's a good analogy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Mann.
Thank you. Thanks for both of those great questions.
Thanks so much for the great questions, and thanks for coming on today. I'm glad we were able to. There's so many questions I want to ask you, Doctor. I'm so glad Deandra asked you about the geoengineering. So that's great that we were able to have her come on and so that's almost it for this week's Climate of Change. Before we go, we'll just give a few words to Calgary Climate Hub co-chair, my good friend, Dr. Joe Vipon. So go ahead, Dr. Joe, take it away.
Hello. Wow, it's been so great to hear your voice, Michael, and your wisdom. This has been a spectacular night for us. I just wanted to reach out to all the participants. I know it's been a bit of a marathon. There's still 100 of you on the YouTube channel, and I don't know how many on Facebook. But it's wonderful to be able to present this. And I just wanted to reiterate why the Calgary Climate Hub exists. It exists because a lot of the climate action needs to take place at a hyper-local level. Our back door is the gateway to good climate action. And we, as Steve said earlier in the presentation, we are on the front lines of Canada's climate fight. This is the energy capital, but it's right now the fossil fuel capital, and it doesn't have to be. We can be an energy capital, and we need to diversify our viewpoints as well as our industry, so that we recognize that the world doesn't end when oil and gas ends, and that we can support our fellow workers, we can support our industry into a new era, not only because it's the right thing to do, but we have no choice. This is where the world is going. This is what we have to do in order to save our own asses. So, so the Calgary Climate Hub exists only because of the generosity of its members, and that's you out there. Please, if you're not a member, become a member. I tell you, it's really, really, really hard to raise money for climate in this town. So we could use every penny. If you thought this is worthwhile, this is considered a pay as you will. If you thought this was worth, the almost 2 hours of your time, what would you pay for a movie? What would you pay for a good book? What would you pay to sit down and have coffee with Michael Mann? And put that, and maybe somebody can put in the chat our donation page out there.
And Americans contribute as well?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
And also consider donating your time. We are a volunteer-based organization. We have 3 employees, but tens to hundreds of members that are actively moving the ball on this. So you can find all of that on our webpage. And I'll turn it back to Steve Bentley for final goodbyes.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Michael, for being there for us.
Thank you.
And, you know, I'll just add a little bit to what Dr. Joe just said, and that is that, you know, if climate is something that affects you and you feel it here, like, you know, we've all lived in this city when the sky turns red from the smoke from the West Coast. And what I can tell you is, if I didn't have a climate hub, I don't know how I'd get through that. Ultimately, what I can tell you is it really, really makes a difference being able to go in the midst of the climate crisis when we feel it the most and when we feel it the little, to sit around the table with a bunch of smart people that are working on the necessary shift that we all have to do it and legitimately moving the ball. We're not about just talking about it. We're about trying to make this thing work. And what I often quote Joan Baez, who said, "The antidote to despair is action." And I can tell you, I've lived it. I know it's true. So if climate is something that affects you, as it does me, as it does Dr. Joe, as it does Dr. Michael E. Mann, do yourself a favor. Get a climate hub in your life. Become a part of it. Join it. And if you can't spend that time because you don't have it, but maybe you got a few extra bucks, it's just like Joe says, climate's a tough dollar in this city. Help us out. A few quick thank yous once again. First of all, I want to thank the Climate Hub board and the volunteers that help make this show happen. Most specifically, Dr. Joe and Pamela and Joan and Kurt and so many others. My good friend and producer Shay Rogers. A few quick thank yous once again to Alberta Eco Trust and Skyfire Energy for supporting this broadcast, to the City of Calgary for letting us be a part of this important climate symposium, and another reminder to visit their website and soak up as much of the great events coming up over the next few days as you can. A reminder that you can get a hold of an autographed plated copy of Dr. Mann's historically important book, The New Climate War, from the University of Lethbridge bookstore, the link for which is in the chat. I think it's at the top of the chat. You may have to dig for it, or maybe somebody's going to place it in there. Where are we at here? Oh yeah, and then a final reminder about our next episode with the good folks from Drawdown, Alberta, on April 14th. You can RSVP for that right away. Joe, maybe you can stop sharing your screen there, or maybe Shay's. We can close you out. There we go. Well, we'll see what happens. Let's see. Beyond that, Dr. Michael E. Mann, I want to thank you so much, both personally for the opportunity for me to do this with you, but also on behalf of my beloved Calgary Climate Hub and the Climate Hub Southern Alberta. I can assure you our organizations are abuzz with this. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation. Wonderful questions. I felt like, it was a good conversation, which is all you can hope for. So.
In addition to the thanks, I'm going to make you a promise tonight. And that is, well, my Calgary Climate Hub partnered up with the Climate Hub of Southern Alberta for this event. And in fact, none of this would have happened without them. And of course, some important stick handling from Professor James Byrne of the University of Lethbridge. And ultimately, we decided early on in this process to treat this event as a coalition building moment. And I can report to you some success in that regard, Dr. Mann. The promise to you is that we're going to keep building. In fact, Excellent. We've reached out to climate hubs across Canada, and we've invited them to hop over to our Facebook Live post, because we've been simulcasting to Facebook Live. So from tonight's event. So once we're done here on Zoom, to come over to Facebook Live and come and talk about how we can come together and help get this country where it's got to be on climate. We also extend that invitation to anybody watching tonight that wants to help Calgary, Alberta, Canada, or the world smoothly transition to a prosperous, climate-friendly future that leaves nobody behind. And finally, I'll reiterate again, thanks again to Alberta Eco Trust and Skyfire for helping us keep the lights on here. Thank you so much. But finally, I want to thank you, the viewer. Thank you for your time. Good night for now, and let's get to work. Good night,
Thanks
Dr.
so
Mann.
much.